Hi, and welcome to Unplanned, the show about cities and how they work. Today on Unplanned, we're going to have a great show because we are really honored to be joined today by the Commissioner of the Cambridge Police Department, Branville G, who has been with Cambridge Police since 2017, but before that was a top cop in Philadelphia and was the chief of the Police Department of the Philadelphia Housing Authority. We are also joined by Brian Corr, who's the executive director both of the Peace Commission here in Cambridge and also the Police Review and Advisory Board, another entity here in Cambridge, Massachusetts. I want to remind you to subscribe to Unplanned. We're going to have lots more interesting conversations like today's conversation in the future. And to know what's going on Unplanned, the best way to do that is to subscribe. But without delay, on today's hot and really important topics of policing, race, community, structural racism, and so many other issues that we are all confronting in America today, I want to welcome both Commissioner Bard and Brian Corr.
Thank you. Thanks, Sam.
Commissioner, I'm going to start with you because you are now the top cop in Cambridge. You come from Philadelphia, which has got a lot of police going on there, so you have the view from that perspective as well. I guess I'd start with the most general, the most kind of 30,000-foot view. Where are we today on all of these issues about policing and race? George Floyd was killed, murdered by a police officer in Minneapolis. That officer was fired from the force and is being charged or has been charged. You sit atop a police department in Massachusetts, and you've been many years on forces. Where do you see us today?
Where do I see us? I see us as a profession in need of serious reform. The fact that Mr. Floyd was murdered tragically has once again put it to the forefront, but it's an issue that's been constantly there, for not just several years, but decades. And we, as a society and as a profession, have inadequately addressed the underlying issues. I feel like for the profession, the law enforcement profession, we know the two of the issues that cause the most distrust between us and minority communities are race and transparency. And we resist or have failed to take the necessary steps to be fully transparent and to adequately deal with issues surrounding race and our conduct in minority communities, and in fact have exacerbated issues such as disproportionate minority contacts and disparate impacts within, I think if you look at the criminal justice system, you can clearly see that at every key decision-making point, minorities are disparately impacted. And for whatever reason, we don't implement protective strategies when it comes to minority populations.
Well, let's start with the issue of race first, and then we'll get to the issue of transparency. What specifically in your many years of being an officer, and when you joined the Cambridge force, because I know people in Cambridge, somebody said, one of the things they liked about you being here was that you'd been a street cop. You'd seen it from the street level. What do you think needs to happen on the issues of race and policing? There's so many discussions going on today. From your perspective, what do you think are the first few steps?
I think one of the things we need to do is meaningfully monitor all of our interactions with citizens, but particularly with minority citizens. If you look at the departments today, we typically submit some type of racial profiling report. Many departments do. And we typically use the baseline or the benchmark of the population when, there are more meaningful ways we could look at those interactions to see what, if any, differences exist. Those are some of the things that I hope that we're going to do here in Cambridge, that we're set to do here in Cambridge. Yes, look at it by the population benchmark, but then take a more meaningful look in an effort to be more protective.
And before we bring Brian into the conversation, what about the transparency issue? I think there's a feeling kind of broadly felt out there among a lot of people of a lot of different races and backgrounds and ethnicities and histories that, you know, in some instances, the cops don't seem to be accountable to anybody in particular. And with the protests and some of the reactions by police departments across the country, it seemed excessive and unnecessary given what the protesters were trying to achieve. So that's my take on it. But what's your take on transparency and the issue of just letting people know what's happening with their police departments?
So, I mean, you're never going to hear me argue against efforts at holding police more accountable or making sure that we're more transparent. When I came here to Massachusetts from Pennsylvania, I thought it odd that, for instance, disciplinary action you could not, you know, disclose here in the state by statute or by this, you know, court decision. I think that so you have an incident that could be very public that occurs, but the disciplinary action, if any occurs, has to be private, and that flies in the face of that whole trust building, the trust building efforts and the transparency. You know, the ability to ensure that the officer was in fact held accountable. And so I think that I support efforts at making disciplinary action transparent.
So let's hear from Brian now. Brian, you've been in and around these issues for a long time, and you have this interesting kind of dual role of, you know, promoting peace in the community, which is obviously a very powerful role, but also the police review and advisory issue, which is about, I believe it's about civilian oversight of police and their actions and police departments. What's your take on all this that we've just been talking about with the commissioner?
Yeah. Well, thanks for that question. And let me premise this by saying I have another role, which is I also do work extensively on the national level on civilian oversight. So I'm the immediate past president of the National Association for Civilian Oversight of Law Enforcement, NACOLE, and had spent 3 years as president and still on the board for a couple more years. So, I'm going to bring in that national perspective as well. But here in Cambridge, by any measure, we have a department that's very forward-looking, is working to be as progressive as I think possible, developing innovative programs, working to meet all of these needs. But as you're hearing a lot right now, police are asked to do all sorts of things that other agencies have not been to do, and the department's been working to address those. Now, having said that, you know, no one's perfect. We do get complaints. We actually get compared to our size around the country, we get a very low number of complaints, and we take them all very seriously. It's important that when anyone has a negative interaction with a police officer, whatever the specifics were, and that's everything from having a conversation with the person, hearing them out, doing some form of mediation, conciliation, working with the police department professional standards people to do an investigation, and then having our board of 5 residents who make determinations about whether police officers follow policies, procedures, practices. And we also do outreach here in this community to make people do know about it. Like every oversight agency I'm aware of, people will often say, oh, I've never heard of that. I didn't know we had that. And in Cambridge, I do think we're in the relatively enviable position of having a community where people are not shy about making complaints, whether it's about bicycles or people not wearing masks or trees that have been cut down, but people not making complaints about this. And I'll just add that you'll hear people say, well, maybe they don't have any faith in the process. They don't have any faith in the civilian oversight. But they'll also say our city councilors aren't receiving complaints, the local media, you don't see things on blogs or Facebook. So here, it's actually a very good place for me to be doing this work. We're able to see how the efforts to increase transparency. And
I'm going to jump in here, Brian. I want to get back to a point that you made earlier. And that is this broader issue about and Commissioner, you're included in this question here, is the responsibilities that have been handed over to the police that include a whole lot of responsibilities that we might not think of as traditionally police responsibilities, whether that's dealing with the homeless, You can imagine all kinds of other places where a police officer maybe isn't the best person to show up on the scene as the first person. And the argument I understand is that it puts a lot of pressure on the police that maybe could be shared with other civic municipal employees, et cetera. What's your take on that? Brian, you were talking, why don't you start, and then Commissioner, I'd be interested in your take on that.
Yeah, well, let me say, and again, you mentioned I have these two roles, the Peace Commission and the civilian oversight of the police department. So one of the things from my work and my observation is that, as I was sort of saying, Cambridge Department and the entire city government and broader community have figured out how do we do this as well as possible. So you have a department that brought in non-sworn officers, trained people from psychology and other fields into the department. There are very strong connections between the police department, the service providers, people that do outreach to people experiencing homelessness, people in mental health crises, people dealing with addiction. So it's really here, I think we have a model in this city where we have figured out, you know, understanding that some of the federal resources don't go to mental health treatment that obviously need to, or aren't getting the supports they need. But as a community, we've come together in partnership with the police to provide the services. Now, the big
Brian, let's hear from the commissioner on this issue, because obviously it's his people that go out on the street and do these calls. So, Commissioner, what's your perspective on this?
So, I mean, police, the practical part of it is that we're government's most visible representatives. Are we the best person to handle serious injuries? No, but oftentimes the first person on the scene, so we need basic first aid capabilities and understanding. Would you rather have your child born in the hospital with an OBGYN? Yes, but sometimes police end up performing that function because we're government's most visible representative. So yeah, we're more likely to come across somebody in the throes of a mental health crisis initially, or in a substance use disorder initially. So we need to be trained in how to deal with those situations above the baseline so that we can provide proper care and avoid liability. So yeah, I get it. And I hear the calls to saying that, well, police shouldn't be dispatched. But the reality of it is we're most visible and most mobile. So we're likely to be there at 3 in the morning when that person is going through a mental health crisis. We, as a department, employ licensed clinical social workers who follow up on all non-emergency mental health issues. And quite frankly, when it's an emergency, oftentimes they'll ask us to go along because somebody in the throes of a mental health crisis may need additional assistance. So yeah, I hear the calls, but we are government's most visible representative and likely to encounter individuals in need of specific services first.
Commissioner, I want to switch gears slightly to get us back to kind of the topics of the day. Obviously, there have been protests across the country. There's a protest here in Cambridge, protests in Boston, and cities around the country, and frankly around the world. As an officer, as a leader of a department, what's been your reaction or response to these protests?
That's a loaded question. So as an individual, I mean, I welcome the protests because I welcome the change. I think that, you'd be naive to think that reform wasn't necessary. And these protests, particularly the peaceful protests, are done in a way that, give meaning to that purpose and help spur it along and help spur that reform along. As someone in charge of a police department, I support peaceful protests, and you can protest peacefully as long as you like, and we're going to do everything we can to make sure that you're safe while doing that, controlling traffic and blocking intersections for you to make sure that you have everything you need to safely get your message across.
Yeah, I mean, I just say as an individual, somebody who's interacted in light ways in a public role with the police and police departments, it's a job that is very challenging and very demanding, and I think everybody recognizes that. Brian, I want to switch to you about some of the proposals that are out there, and Commissioner, we'll come back to you about these, but I don't know if you've spent any time looking at, I believe it's called AIDS Can't Wait. It's a set of proposals about reforms that would help make policing more constructive in communities and less challenging. What are your thoughts on some of the ideas that are being floated around, going maybe starting from defunding the police all the way through more administrative procedural changes? Have you thought at all about these?
I'd say I've been thinking about it nonstop, and part of it again is that national work I do on oversight. So, you know, that's a whole podcast or series in and of itself. But I'll try to keep it short. Overall, there's lots of great proposals. I think the key to many of them are looking at how do we impose rules on the system so that police can't do A, B, C, and D. And that's very important. I guess what I would say is I am very interested in these ideas of front-end accountability, and I think it's actually even more powerful when instead of saying, what are the limits on police power, we lay out what police should be doing and how they should be doing, and we set policing that is based on the needs and standards of the community. So It Can't Wait is great, and the commissioner can certainly speak to that here in Cambridge. And there's tons of different proposals. I guess the other piece is people, very good reason, there's a sense of urgency. People want to do something now. And what that means is people are kind of out there, you know, kind of, we want to throw things against the wall and see what sticks. And what I would say are people like NACOLE, who've been people doing this work for decades in civilian oversight and accountability. There are progressive policing leaders like Commissioner Bard, people in groups like NACOLE, National Black Police Leaders, and there are a lot of people in the field who are doing work, as well as academics and advocates like the ACLU. So overall, my message would be, yes, we need reform. I work in government. I believe in government. I believe in reform rather than revolution. And yet we need those revolutionary voices to push it forward. But we need to engage the people who are doing this work every day to make the change.
Let me ask you, Brian, what about the issue of race in policing? I'd like to hear your thoughts about that briefly. And I also want to hear from both of you, because it does come up very often in all of these discussions, the issue of unions and potentially the power that unions, the police unions have in controlling and shaping their contracts and what they are subject to and what they're not subject to. Brian, why don't you start on those two topics?
Okay, well, big topics here, but deeply important, especially as we're recording this on Juneteenth, you know, so it's definitely a time to think about history. And when we look at the history of this nation, intertwined in everything is the triple legacy of militarism and genocide and racism, along with the economic systems of oppression.
What about race and police? Let's get right to that.
So that's what I want to say, is because I think that race and policing it's part of this bigger issue. We can't separate it from our history. So specifically when we think about policing, there are two aspects. There's a historical piece, but then there's the day-to-day. We live in a society where there is inequality, people are treated differently. So we have to do things like get implicit bias. How do we recognize that, mitigate it? You can't get rid of it. So training, awareness, you have to look at what are the structural systems. We talk about things like civil service and how civil service.
Well, but what about that? Because that is kind of the next piece that I want to look at. I want to hear from the commissioner on it as well. But what do you think about that? You've obviously been thinking about these for many years. Where does that fit in the picture?
I'm sorry, for the commissioner.
Oh, no, Brian, why don't you give me your thoughts really quickly?
Yeah, I mean, just quickly,
civil
service, you know, it's a lot like unions. I grew up in Detroit. I'm a big fan of unions. There are certain unions that, you know, may have been able to exercise power in a way that's not right. And there aren't that many of them. And I think civil service in certain states, when the commissioner was talking about our transparency in Massachusetts, civil service can end up being a way for certain people to get advantages. And the whole idea was that you would get rid of patronage and corruption. And I'm not saying it's corrupt or patronage, but when you have advantages for certain groups like veterans who, you know, deserve a lot from the society they protected. But when we look at policing, what's happening is that certain people are able to become policemen more easily. And then you have the history of what people have gone through. So whatever the police are doing people have their
Yeah.
own experience as a racialized
Right.
person.
Let's hear from the
plays into it.
commissioner about the civil service issue, because I think that's a complicated one, and it's going to be one that, if it is an issue in this bigger picture, it's going to take a while to untangle. Commissioner, what's your perspective on all that?
So yeah, civil service was once a necessary tool, but now it's become more of an impediment for towards diversity. I mean, we seek to make sure that the departments are reflective of the communities that we serve, and its rigid format makes it an impediment to us being able to create and maintain that diverse workforce. So we've been looking for ways to deal with that, looking at whether we need to work with the unions to leave civil service completely, both for the entry level and for testing to move up within ranks, but also whether we can use other programs like the cadet program, which allows us to hire Cambridge residents for like a 2-year program, and then they still have to take the civil service test. But once they take and pass that test, then we can pull them off the list no matter where they fall in on that list. So it helps us to allow more women to join the force and more minorities to join the force and create a diverse program. We actually graduated our first cadet from the police academy. The days are all blended 2 days ago. So there are ways around it, but it is an impediment.
Commissioner, would you speak to the, if it's your view, the importance of a diverse police force, both in terms of racial makeup, but also in terms of gender, and what that brings both to a force and to the community it serves?
It's all about, it all works into that trust issue. You know, it's not saying that an officer of one race can't dutifully police a community of another, but a community would like to see that the department was reflective of it and in and of itself and representative of itself. So when you have a more diverse force, it just helps to build trust with the community that you serve. For instance, one area that we fall woefully short, the Cambridge Police Department, we're 11% female. In society, there's almost 51% female. So we're doing everything we can to ensure that we recruit, and not just recruit, but then support the female population as they work their way through the rank structures, so that they can not just be members of the department, but be contributing members and progressive members of the department. So
we're at the part of the program where I'm going to do a wrap-up question, and I always start by just thanking you both for joining us. It's a great conversation, and it's so clearly a conversation that needs to continue at the local level, not just here in Massachusetts, but across this country. Commissioner, looking at Cambridge specifically, and Brian, you're going to get a similar kind of question, but looking at Cambridge specifically, what are you hopeful about? What are you supportive about? And what do you feel needs to continue to change? What's a plus and what's a delta, to use the language of meeting talk?
So one of the things that made it attractive to lead the Cambridge Police Department was the fact that about a decade ago, a little more than that now, the department made a pronounced switch to adopt a community policing philosophy, where our legitimacy was derived from the community, our authority was derived from the community in the form of legitimacy. So that meant looking at all of our practices and procedures and policies and making sure they were as humanistic as possible. So it required us to look at the use of force. So, you know, you talked about the 8 Can't Wait platform a while ago, but we've met all of those requirements, all of those 8 pillars or principles for the better part of a decade, with the exception of requiring the duty to intervene. And I fixed that with a general order about a week ago. But it required that, you know, we ban chokeholds. It required that we already required the least amount of force necessary. So it required that look at all of the policies and make sure that they took human life and the value of human life and elevated above everything else. So the fact that the department was already progressive and reform-minded gave me hope that I could come and help implement some future reforms and continue that. So that's what we need to continue doing. we were out in front of that curve. And, you know, I always say that you can be swept up by change or you can lead it. And Cambridge and the Cambridge Police Department always lead that change. So,
Commissioner, I'm going to ask one follow-up question because I get to host this thing. And then, Brian, I'm going to come to you. On the duty to intervene, do you think that's going to be problematic? I gather in other forces it can be challenging for an officer to intervene with another officer. What's your sense of that?
It shouldn't be problematic. And, you know, our policy for more than a decade had already said that, told officers what could happen if they didn't intervene, that they could be civilly or criminally liable, but it did not actually say they had the duty to intervene. I will say that since 2016, the actual use of force training did inform officers that they had the duty to intervene, but it shouldn't be. We all saw that video, the Minneapolis officer, Mr. Floyd's killer, and it was horrible. I mean, for you to stand there and watch that to occur is like watching the humanity go out of yourself. I don't need, I mean, we're not even, if I'm at that scene, we're not even talking about his murder because it's not going to happen. I'm not going to let somebody do that in front of me. So should it be a problem? It shouldn't be a problem. And that's that. We got to raise the cost for bad behavior and raise the cost for failing to act, period.
Commissioner, I want to thank you. I want to give Brian the opportunity to give his plus and delta here in Cambridge. And let me just say, Brian, I know I didn't give you as much time to get into some of the big picture issues that I know you think about all the time, but it's rare to have the commissioner on, so I wanted to just make sure I gave him plenty of time to speak. But what's something you feel, what's something you're very happy about here in Cambridge, and one thing you think still needs our work, our attention?
I mean, there's so many great things about this city. You know, I love living in this city. I love working here. And I think one of our biggest positives is that we are a physically dense city. I live a 6-minute walk from my office, and sometimes it takes me 45 minutes to get to work because we have so many interactions. There's so much richness. And that can be our challenge as well, which is that we have all of these different people that live in this small space, but don't actually have relationships with people who aren't part of their circle, whether it's an academic circle, their class circle, where they grew up, whatever that is. So I think my delta is actually, and then I do think it's relevant to this conversation, is we need to continue to find ways for people to develop interpersonal relationships. A lot of what the police department is asked to do are actually things that if people just knew their neighbors, they could just go next door and say, hey, could you stop playing basketball in half an hour because I'm trying to study for a final? Or, hey, you know, I'm really concerned about whatever. And that would really be a positive step for our community. And I think I'll kind of close with saying that in the wake of everything that's happened and the horrific murder of George Floyd, and all the other names and lives that we've seen lost, that we're suddenly as a society coming to grips with and on the verge of doing something, we have to do it in a way that still builds community. It's so easy in this time of pandemic and racial unrest, need for racial justice to get divided and to feel that we have to pick sides. And I think what we need to do in Cambridge is continue to focus on how do we come together as a community to make the changes that we all almost universally agree on. And I think, again, that's our greatest strength. We have so many resources, so many different people, and if we can come together and agree that we all want the same thing, we all want a peaceful, equitable, and just community. I think that's we need to be a little more focused on how we do that together.
Ryan, I think you speak words of wisdom with lots of experience behind it, and maybe we'll get a chance to explore some of those bigger picture ideas. I heard you quoting some of the 1967 King speech, and I thought that's a whole topic unto itself. In the meantime, Commissioner, I want to thank you very much for taking some time to spend with us. It's a real pleasure. It's a real pleasure to get to know you a little bit more, and you know, keep up your good work. Cambridge is a wonderful community. The Cambridge Police do a very good job, and it's a tough job. We know that. Brian, thank you. Thanks for all the work you do and knitting this community together and being just a good person, making the world a better place. So
thanks for doing this, Sam.
Yeah, thanks for this opportunity.
Yes.